She was a mail-order bride who arrived on a Wednesday and was left on the platform before the hour was out. The coach from the railhead came in at 2:30. She was the last one off, single bag, a dress that had been pressed before the journey and had not survived it. Her hands loose at her sides and her chin level, in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart. Albert Pugh was waiting at the far end of the platform with a folded paper, and the look of a man who had been rehearsing bad news long enough that the rehearsing had made it worse. He'd filed the contract 8 months prior with the agency. He'd spent the time since changing his mind, and he hadn't written a single letter, because a letter would have required a kind of courage he didn't possess, until there were witnesses around. She'd spent 3 years at the orphanage where she grew up, staying on to take in mending, saving what she could, just waiting. When the solicitation came, she read it twice, signed her name, and spent her last dime on the ticket. Albert said he couldn't go through with it, said it loud enough to carry. That was the real cruelty of it, because the platform wasn't empty. By supper, half the town would know, and by morning, the rest would. She stood there and let him finish, hands still at her sides, her face doing exactly what she needed it to do. He waved the agency papers once, not a deed. Everyone on that platform knew a woman wasn't land and couldn't be claimed like dirt, but he held them like a man who needed the weight of paper behind him. Then he shoved them back in his coat and walked away without looking back. The platform cleared out around her. She stayed put, bag at her feet. The town spread out in front of her, offering no clear answer to what came next. Across the street, a man came out of the hardware store with a paper sack of fittings and stopped on the edge of the boardwalk. 32 years old, broad in the shoulders, carpenter's hands, sawdust on his sleeve from the morning's work. He had the look of a man who'd carried too much for too long enough that he'd stopped noticing the weight of it. He stood on that step and read the scene. The platform, the bag, her straight back, the empty space where a man had just been standing. And then he crossed the street, stopped at the bottom of the platform steps, and looked up at her. "Seth Callan," he said. "I've got 2 kids and a house that needs keeping. I do carpentry work 3 days a week, so mornings you'd have the place to yourself." He held her gaze. "It's temporary. Room and board until you've sorted out what comes next." She looked at him for a long moment, taking the full measure of the man. "Can you cook?" he asked. She met his eyes. "I can, and I ain't afraid of hard work." She picked up her bag. "Then let's go," she said. They walked off the platform together, and behind them the town watched, storing it all up for later. The cabin sat at the edge of town, a horse in a side pen and a porch step that had been meaning to get fixed for a while. She noted it without a word. Inside, the front room was clean in that specific way of a house managed by a man living alone, functional, orderly, with absolutely nothing soft in it. A workbench sat along the far wall, a stove doing its steady work. On the shelf above the kitchen window sat a small sewing basket with a wooden lid. It had the look of a thing nobody had touched in a long time. Something everyone in that house had quietly agreed to just leave be, Seth told her. The room off the kitchen was hers. Her own door, her own space. The kids ate at 6. He ate whenever he got back. Jack came out from the rear of the house with the exact timing of a boy who'd been listening from somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. 10 years old. His father's build already showing in the shoulders. A face that kept its own counsel. He looked at Willa the way a person looks at something they've seen a version of before, and aren't quite ready to feel differently about. He looked at his father. Then he turned and went right back the way he came, without a single word, which said plenty. Mary didn't make an entrance so much as she just materialized. 6 years old, one ribbon tied properly, and the other just hanging there, standing near the bedroom doorway with the full, unguarded attention of a child who hasn't yet learned to want things quietly. She looked at Willa with her whole face. Willa looked right back, steady and even. Nothing performed or put on. "Are you hungry?" Willa asked. Mary considered this with dead seriousness. "A little bit. Come help me find what's in the larder." Mary came over without a second of hesitation. Supper that first night was beans and cornbread, and a broth that had no business smelling as good as it did, given what that larder actually held. The smell reached the front room before anybody even sat down. Seth came in from the yard and stopped just inside the door. Something moved across his face, a ghost of a thing, but he set it aside. Jack ate quietly. Mary ate with her eyes moving between her bowl and Willa in a steady, unbroken rotation. Partway through the meal, Mary set her spoon down. She announced that the last woman who kept house for them had burned every single thing she touched. Seth said her name, a quiet warning. Mary looked at Willa instead. She did, though. Burnt beans are a serious matter, Willa said, keeping her eyes on her plate. I don't take 'em lightly. Jack looked up. The corner of his mouth twitched once, then went right back to where it had been. He didn't say another word, but when supper was done, he sat at that table just a little longer than he needed to before heading off to bed, and Seth noted it without a word. The following morning, Seth stepped off the porch, and that loose step held rock solid under his boot. He stopped, pressed his weight into it again, stewed there for a long moment. He walked back inside, poured 2 cups of coffee, and left one on the counter right near where Willa was working. Not a damn thing said about the step. She didn't say a thing about it either. They drank their coffee in that early quiet, and the cold morning settled in around the cabin. Jack tested her on the 5th day. He simply didn't do the chore she'd asked of him, and settled in to wait for the fallout. Willa appeared in the doorway of the back room. Jack. He looked up. I was getting to it. I know. Get to it now, please. He looked at her, held her gaze, found whatever it was he was looking for in it, then got up and hauled the wood in without another word of argument. She thanked him plainly and went right back to the kitchen. Seth had heard the whole thing from his workbench. He set his plane down and just stood there in the quiet for a while before picking it back up. The days found their natural shape after that. Jack started staying at the table after meals, whittling or reading, present in a way he hadn't been in a long time. Mary followed Willa from room to room with the absolute devotion of a small shadow, helping where her hands could reach and watching carefully where they couldn't. Seth started coming home from his carpentry jobs at the exact same hour every evening. One evening, Willa read to Mary from the book of stories on the shelf, doing all the voices without a shred of embarrassment. Mary pressed up against her side with the complete trust of a child who's made a decision and sees zero reason to ever revisit it. Jack sat at the far end of the room, working something in his hands. He didn't look up, but he didn't leave either. By the time the heavy frost settled into the mornings for good, Mary had stopped trailing Willa like she was a guest, and started trailing her like a child in her own home. It was a gray, entirely unremarkable morning when it happened. Mary was moving through the kitchen in her socks, still warm from sleep, absorbed in some private little business of her own, when she caught her foot on the threshold between the kitchen and the hall, and went down hard on both palms. The sound she made was that sharp, startled kind, the kind that hangs in the air right before a child decides if the pain warrants tears. She decided it did. Willa was down on the floor with her before the crying had even fully started. Took both those small hands in hers, looked at the palms, and held them warm and steady. Not making a fuss, not going anywhere. And Mary, without meaning to say anything at all, said the one word that was simply true. Mama. It drifted into the cabin air and it did not leave. Willa's hands stayed exactly where they were. She took one breath, no more, and then she gathered the girl in and held her right there until the crying ran itself dry, calm and certain, giving no outward sign of what that word had just done to the room. Seth was standing in the bedroom doorway. He'd heard it. He stood with one hand resting on the frame, staring at the hallway floor without moving a muscle. Something was shifting deep inside him, and he kept his eyes safely away from it, because some things change the exact moment you look at them straight on. At the table, Jack had gone completely still. 10 years old. He knew exactly what he'd heard and exactly what it meant, and something in his face that had been locked shut for a long time was working slowly toward open. Seth went back into his room, sat on the edge of the bed with his hand flat on his knee, and just stayed there while the morning moved quietly around the house. Abigail Cutler came to stand beside Willa at the general store counter on a Friday afternoon. She had the warm, practiced manner of a woman delivering a dose of concern she'd carefully prepared at home. She spoke about appearances, about what folks were saying, about the natural shape a situation takes when it's left alone too long, and the heavy confusion that comes from children getting the wrong idea about what an arrangement actually is. She chose her words the way a man chooses tools, for exactly what they could do. She left without buying a damn thing. Willa set her coins on the counter one at a time and walked back home. 25 years old, and she'd been assessed by women with prepared voices in enough cold rooms that she'd built a durable kind of patience for it. The patience of a woman who knew damn well that another person's measure of her wasn't the gospel truth. She stood at the kitchen window with her hands resting on the sill, looked at the yard and the line of pines beyond it, and that cold, flat sky, for a lot longer than she needed to. Then she started supper. That evening Seth was standing by the stove, and she was finishing up the dishes. And without looking up from the fire, he said, "You doing all right?" She kept her hands deep in the wash basin and thought about it honestly. "I am," she said. Once at the flames, she went back to washing the dishes, and the room held its steady quiet around them both. Nearly a month later, Dale Marsh had absolutely no intention of causing trouble. He was standing at the saloon on a Tuesday evening, talking the way men talk at the end of a long, hard day. Easy, unhurried. He mentioned the Callan place was looking a little different lately. Smoke rising at the right hours. The kids seemed steadier on their feet. That woman from the platform. The one Albert had left standing there in front of half the town. Something about her, Dale said. The kids had taken to her like nothing he'd ever seen before. The older boy was coming around, and the younger one had started calling her Mama. He reached for his glass. Albert had gone dead still at the far end of the bar. Dale kept right on talking, completely oblivious. Said it was just good to see that house with some actual life in it again. Albert stared at the row of whiskey bottles across from him. He still had those agency papers tucked in his coat. He had a bruised pride that had been sitting dead wrong in his gut since that day on the platform, and now there was a picture forming in his head. Warm light in the windows, children settled, smoke at the right hours, a woman the kids had already begun to call Mama. He slapped a few coins on the wood and stood up. "Where exactly does Callan live?" he asked. It was a Thursday morning, bitter cold and crystal clear. Seth and Willa were walking out of the post office together. He'd gone in to collect a timber notice. She'd walked down with him because the kids were at school, and the morning just naturally ran that way. That's when Albert stepped out into the dead center of the street. He had those agency papers in his hand, and his voice was pitched loud enough to carry. "The fare was paid," he shouted. "The contract signed. An obligation doesn't just dissolve because a woman found somewhere a little more comfortable to lay her head." He held those papers up high, like a deed to a gold mine, even though every soul on that street knew exactly what they were. Then he used the word his, and the whole street heard it land like a lead weight. Everything slowed down. A woman over by the dry goods stopped dead in her tracks. Two men standing outside the feed store turned around. The freezing air just held everything frozen in place. Willa stood right beside Seth. She didn't take a single step back. She didn't even look at Albert. She held herself the exact same way she'd held herself on that train platform. Still, straight-backed, unbroken. Except this time there was a man standing right next to her, and the whole damn street could see that he hadn't flinched an inch. Seth looked at the papers. He looked at Albert. Then he turned to Willa, his voice low and dead even. "Stay right here." It wasn't a command. It was the way you speak to someone you fully intend on coming back to. He walked straight over to the bank, 4 minutes inside. He walked out with the money he'd been keeping under the floorboards for 2 solid years. Every last cent he'd set aside toward buying his way back into a proper ranch. The slow, grueling, patient work of a man rebuilding his life from the dirt up. He crossed the street, pressed that roll of cash tight into Albert's hand, and held it there until Albert's fingers finally closed around it. "That settles the fare, the agency fee, and every last excuse you rode in here with." His voice was flat as slate and just as final. "It doesn't buy her. It frees her from you now. Get gone." Albert looked down at the money. He looked at the street that was staring right back at him. He took one last look at Willa, and whatever it was he found written on her face, it sure wasn't what he'd ridden into town looking for. So he turned, walked to his horse, and rode out, and the cold morning just closed right up behind him. The street held its collective breath. Seth turned around, not to the crowd. To her, she was already looking right at him, hands loose at her sides. That deep exhaustion she'd been carrying since the train platform was completely gone from her eyes. Something a hell of a lot steadier had taken its place. It was the look of a woman standing on ground that finally holds firm. He stood there in front of her. The wind came sweeping off the hills between them, clean and biting cold. He'd crossed that street before he'd even consciously decided to do it. He'd left a cup of coffee on a counter and made absolutely nothing of it. He just handed 2 years of hard savings over to another man without a second's pause, because standing by while she was taken away simply wasn't a thing he was capable of doing. He wasn't a man who dressed things up to look finer than they actually were, and he sure wasn't about to start now. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "as my wife, if that's what you want." She looked up at this man, and she took the quiet space that choosing for herself required. Nobody rushed her, and that cold street just waited. "Yes," she said, quietly and completely, with nothing held back. "That's exactly what I want." He let out a long, slow breath. His rough hand found hers and closed tight around it. Around them, the town slowly came back to itself. The scrape of boots on the boardwalk. A door somewhere opening and falling shut. The wind coming off the hills steady and clean, and that pale winter sky just going on forever above it all. The ranch was going to have to wait. But for the first time in years, waiting didn't feel a damn thing like losing. Jack was sitting at the table with a short length of wood, and his father's smallest block plane. He was working the edge down by pure feel, the tip of his tongue caught between his teeth. Mary was down on the floor with her rag doll, knee-deep in some matter of considerable importance that didn't require any adult involvement whatsoever. From the stove came the rich smell of something cooking with molasses. A new recipe Willa was working out, just adjusting it as she went along. The kind of smell that seeps deep into the timber of a kitchen and stays locked in there for years. The heavy front door opened. A rush of cold air, and then the heavy thud of Seth's boots on the step. It was the sound of a man who knows he's expected home, and has finally stopped taking that simple fact for granted. Mary raised the rag doll briefly in his direction by way of a greeting, then went right back to her business. Jack looked up at his father standing in the doorway. Then he looked back down at the wood plane, and just kept on working. But that look had carried something in it that sure hadn't been there at the start of things. Seth hung up his heavy coat, stood over to the stove, stood right beside Willa, and looked down at what was simmering there. She moved the wooden spoon toward him without a single word. He tasted it, considered it quietly and without rushing. Then he looked at her. She took the spoon back. "I know," she said. "More molasses." The corner of his mouth hitched up just a fraction. He went back to hang his coat properly and left her to it. Up on the shelf above the window, that old sewing basket sat exactly where it had always sat. The late afternoon light came angling through the glass, found that wooden lid, and just rested there, warm and still. Outside, the wind moved heavy through the pines at the edge of the property. The horse shifted its weight out in the pen. From somewhere way past the tree line, a bird called out just once, long and unhurried. Inside, the cabin held its warmth tight, not waiting for anyone, not anymore. And I reckon that's the story of Willa, a woman who arrived with nothing to her name but a single bag and a steel spine, and ended up walking away with everything that actually matters in this world. Let me know down in the comments if this one resonated with you. I appreciate you listening.